This is the Writescast Network, brought to you by Dandelion Web Marketing, Lost Lake Press, and Kill Your Darlings Candle Company, and always streaming at writescast.net. Storytelling, they say, is as old as human language itself. On its face, that statement feels as if it must be true, but why? What is it about human consciousness that's so wired for story? And how can our understanding of these phenomena make us better storytellers? Hey there, I'm author, writing coach, and Writescast Network founder R.R. Campbell, and welcome to episode 85 of your listener-supported R.R. Campbell Writescast here on the Writescast Network, brought to you by Dandelion Web Marketing, Lost Lake Press, and Kill Your Darlings Candle Company. In this episode, I'm joined by Lisa Cron, the author of the aptly titled Wired for Story. Her TEDx talk by the same name opened Furman University's 2014 TEDx conference, and aside from these experiences, Lisa has worked in publishing at W.W. Norton and John Muir Publications, as an agent at the Angelo Rinaldi Literary Agency, as a producer on shows for Showtime and Court TV, and as a story consultant for Warner Brothers and the William Morris Agency. Since 2006, she's been an instructor in the UCLA Extension Writers Program, and she has been on the faculty of the School of Visual Arts MFA program in Visual Narrative in New York City. In 2021, her new book, aimed at the business nonprofit world, Story or Die: How to Use Brain Science to Create Your Own Story to Convince, Persuade, and Inspire, will be published by 10 Speed Press. So yes, Lisa has a lot to teach us about why we humans are so wired for story and what that means for us as storytellers. So I won't keep you from our conversation any longer. Stay tuned after it, however, for more about what you can expect from the Writescast Network, and thanks, as always, for listening. Thank you so much, Lisa Cron, for joining me for this episode of the R.R. Campbell Writescast here on the Writescast Network.
It's my utter pleasure.
Well, I'm really looking forward to this conversation because we're going to be talking about a book of yours that I had the chance to read earlier this year. And that book, of course, is called Wired for Story. But before we get into discussing that phrase in the context of your book, what's behind that phrase more generally?
Well, now that's an interesting question. I mean, it isn't, as the stories in the specific, there's nothing general about it. It is super specific. We are literally, biologically wired for story. It is woven into the architecture of our brain, and we make sense of absolutely everything through narrative. And so when we're being pulled into a story, and one that we're reading, as opposed to one that's trying to convince us of something, which is, the more biological and evolutionary use of story, which is to learn something we didn't know, the better to survive. But when you're creating a story, a novel, a memoir, a movie, there are certain things that we are really wired to immediately seek out, and while we're wired to be grabbed by story, that's biological, and we're influenced by stories every minute of every day, whether we know it or not. To create the kind of story that can rivet people is something very different. And by knowing what it is we're wired to respond to, what we're looking for in a story, really, I think, can help writers, because I personally don't think that's actually being taught anywhere.
And that was why this book really spoke to me in particular, because as someone whose background is in linguistics and who was independently venturing into the world of psycholinguistics, it was so wonderful to see a book taking this approach by exploring how humans have this natural biological propensity for storytelling and how we use it in our everyday lives in ways that I think most people probably don't even think about, because it is, as you say, so innately ingrained within us. And what this makes me wonder, because I know why I sought out your book, what was the impetus for you deciding to write this book?
Well, I'll tell you, I mean, to be completely honest with you, it's because I have a really big mouth, and I felt that I had stumbled onto something that could really help writers, and it was the opposite of what they had been taught, and no one else was talking about it at the time. And writers, when I wrote Wired for Story, writers were my world, and I knew how much it takes to write a novel. I mean, it takes a lot of time. Writers pour, blood, sweat, and tears into it. And, I've spent my career, which spans more decades than, frankly, I want to admit to being alive, evaluating manuscripts in one way or another. And the sad truth is 99% of them are different shades of dreadful. And so, it's one thing to know when something isn't working, right? We all know if you're reading a book, it isn't working, you put it down. A movie, it used to be if a movie wasn't working, you walked out. But since we don't go to theaters anymore, you click off. If your neighbor's doing something ridiculous, you roll your eyes, and you can tell when people are making mistakes. But what I wanted to go into is, okay, I see what the mistake is. What is really riveting us when we're riveted? Because it is not what writers have been taught, which is that it's, writing well, having a way with words, and coming up with a plot. And I have read countless manuscripts that were well written and had rip-roaring plots, and I swear it was crickets, could not be more boring. So the question was, what is pulling us in? And what I realized is that what pulls us in is the way those things are affecting a character, point of view character, hopefully the protagonist, internally, where they're struggling to make some kind of a decision, because stories are about how we make decisions. Stories are about how we change. And so if what was happening up there wasn't causing that character to really struggle internally to figure out what to do, and then, make a decision, and then that often changes what they do, meaning it changes what happens out there in the plot. That's what was pulling us in. In other words, story isn't about an external change. It's about an internal change. And that made me really see that story, regardless the context, regardless the content, regardless the genre, regardless the format, we come for the exact same thing. And that's what I really wanted to get across, because, storytellers, and I don't, can I be really frank? I do not like the term storyteller, because it sounds like someone's sitting down and telling stories to everybody. I like to talk about story itself, because it is literally how we make sense of everything. And writers hear that, what's your narrative arc? And they think that means the plot, and it doesn't. The narrative arc is the internal narrative, the internal story that your point of view character, hopefully your protagonist, is telling themselves in order to make sense of what's happening up there in the plot. That's what we come for, and I really wanted to get that across. And in order to get that across, there's so many things that writers need to focus on that, ironically, they're often told not to focus on. As I'm very fond of saying, I believe that everything we're taught about writing is wrong. I do.
And I think that it's so easy for writers, particularly those who are new to, I know you don't like this word, I know this now, storytelling, but I say it all of the time. So that's going to be my great struggle with conversation. But one of the things that we arrive at as new writers or people who are just new to this world is we have, perhaps as readers, only experienced story in terms of this external relationship. It's something that we received from the world, and we watched it in our heads, so to speak, unfold. And it was probably very visual for us, perhaps, because we rely on our sense of sight to get through the world by and large. It's the first thing that many writers think of. It's the first thing we as humans think of. But I am so relieved to hear that, yes, we have to think about what it is that actually speaks to a reader. And it's this interchange. It is the actual experience of an individual as the world changes them and as they change themselves. But it's that process of change where we get the true story. At least I hope that's my distillation of what it is you have to say there.
100%. Can I tell you about a really interesting neurological study that I just read, neuroscience study, that's fascinating. It goes to exactly this point. It was a neuroscientist named Stephen Brown out of McMaster University, and he wanted to see, when we're reading, you, me, all of us, what pulls us in? What is the first part of our brain that is awakened? What are we looking for when story first hits our brain? And he actually said this in the paper, he thought that it was going to be what Aristotle said. And P.S. Aristotle could not be more wrong. Aristotle said thought first, character second. Could not be more wrong. So what he did was he hooked people up, fMRI, and he had them read, and it was just very simple things. They weren't, like getting lost in a novel or or watching a movie, they were getting very simple headline things like surgeon finds scissors in patient, or a fisherman, sailor saves a young person from drowning lake. And what he discovered is that the part of our brain that immediately activates is the part that mentalizes, which I admit sounds to me like some form of the British slang, to go mental, but doesn't. It means that they are immediately looking for whose story is it, why does it matter to them, what is their intention, what is their motivation, why is what's going to happen going to matter to them, and not just in the generic sense, but in the given what they want and given who they are, which goes to motivation, right? Motivation is always very specific, very subjective. That's what we come to story for. Story is like a Vulcan mind meld. Your protagonist's brain is the command center of everything, and everything in the novel gets its meaning and emotional weight based on how it's affecting that person, and not generically, not just in general, but in terms of them, going after some kind of a difficult goal, something that far predates page one.
And what really stands out to me there is this notion that, again, when we are writers who are we've reached the point where, okay, we've got a story, whether we've written a short story, whether we've written a manuscript, partial, full, whatever the case is, and we share it with someone who's in the industry and who is, quote unquote, in the know. One of the things of feedback you might get is that new writer is, well, this just wasn't compelling. And I think that the big mistake that many writers make is they think of compelling as a what. But what you are saying there, and what I often coach my own clients on, is that compelling is not so much a what as it is a why. We have to get at the heart of motivation. We have to understand why a reader is compelled to care. And that doesn't come in the shape of, well, they're compelled to care because in 20 pages, I'm going to give them a cool twist. And it's like, well, that's 20 pages from now. We've got to be thinking about every line of our manuscript, right? So yes, that why is critically important. And it seems like the study that you have just read really seems to embrace that idea.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I have said this long before Simon Sinek came up with his book on why. I mean, story's not about the what. Story's about the why. It's not about what happens on the surface. It's about what goes on beneath the surface, meaning what the character is really thinking and feeling. And to be very clear, writers make a big mistake when they think about, well, what does the character feel? So they're going to name some emotion, or even worse, they're going to give us a whole bunch of body language. So deeply doesn't matter. How they're feeling comes to this internal struggle and the sense they're trying to make of it, so they can figure out what the heck to do in order to try to achieve their agenda and not be too vulnerable, which is what we're always protecting ourselves from. But I think really the key thing there is that in order to know that, there is a lot of work that you have to do before you get to page one of the novel. Doesn't mean that work is pre-writing or research. It is part of the novel, but that is where the whole story logic comes from. It doesn't come from the plot at all. It comes from the logic by which, and the meaning that your protagonist, and really every character, but predominantly your protagonist, is reading into what's going on and dealing with that problem that they're going to come face to face with on page one. A problem that, let's face it, they've probably brought on themselves, and not brought on in the finger waggy way, oh, you brought that on yourself, but just brought on themselves in that it is the unintended consequences of decisions that they've made, and it's brought them to where they are when the story starts. So that, I mean, yes, you do want to think about the way the reader's going to respond, but much more importantly, you want to go into and create an actual person, meaning the character, the protagonist, so you know how they're going to respond, not just what they're going to do, but way more important, why. Because, really often, think about, in your own life, the reason why it looks like you're doing what you're doing is often really different than the actual reason. And that's what we come for. We come for the actual reason, the thing that people don't say out loud.
Once again, this episode is brought to you by Dandelion Web Marketing. Why? Well, because they are interested in helping writers like you build a thriving author platform through strategic web marketing. If you've got an author website and you're not sure if you're on the right track, well, they can offer you an author website audit, which will help you find out. And right now, listeners of the Writescast Network can take 50% off That's half off one of these audits that looks at your website's content, security, design, search engine optimization, and more. And they'll also provide you with insight into what you can do to better connect with your audience. So to learn more about the strengths and weaknesses of your current website and save 50% along the way, visit dandelionwebmarketing.com/writescast. That's dandelionwebmarketing.com/writescast. And so much of that, like you just said there, it's the thing that's not said aloud. It's what's happening beneath the surface. And that ties into where I wanted to take this conversation next, actually, which is that in your book, Wired for Story, you divide every section of the book into a cognitive secret and then a story secret. So why don't we tease this out just a little bit here so we can use that as a framework for how we explore this conversation going forward? Why is it, first of all, what is a cognitive secret in the context of your book here? And why are cognitive secrets important for us to understand as writers?
Well, because a cognitive secret, I mean, cognitive just meaning how we think. And a cognitive secret is there's so many different ways that we see things in ways that we are not 100% aware of. So the more that we make sort of the unconscious conscious, and I do not mean that in a Freudian or Jungian way. I mean literally boots on the ground, that internal why. For instance, I mean, to give you an example, for instance, most of the decisions that we make every day, we make based on what our cognitive unconscious has us do. We literally, I mean, here's an interesting number to throw out at you. We make 35,000 decisions a day. Now, of those 35,000 decisions we make, we are consciously aware of about 70. And I'm fully convinced that the bulk of those 70 decisions are like, should I wear the yellow socks or the blue socks? Things that, like, who really cares? The rest of those decisions are made by our cognitive unconscious, which means that when something becomes a familiar pattern in our lives, like, nobody went to sleep last night thinking, I sure hope the sun comes up tomorrow because I've got a lot to do. I mean, these days we might think that, I admit it, because it feels like all bets are off. But most of us don't go to sleep thinking that because it's a familiar pattern. It's been relegated to our cognitive unconscious, so we just assume it. Stories are about pulling something that we've relegated down to our cognitive unconscious up to the surface and making us question it. But if I could just say one thing, and I know I've kind of gone far afield of your question, is that when it's what goes on beneath the surface, I want to be really clear that it is stated. It isn't something that's subtle. I'm not talking in any way, shape, or form about subtext or metaphor or anything on that level. It is literally there beneath the surface in terms of what the main character, the point of view character in the scene, hopefully the protagonist all the way through, is thinking. And that is one of the things, two of the things that are the biggest lies that the writing community tells. One is that don't let us know what your character's thinking, is for the reader to find out. And two, don't give us much backstory, only give us backstory sparingly and when the reader needs to know something, which is 100% not true, because you never put anything in because the reader needs to know, even though they do. You put it in because the protagonist or the point of view character needs to figure something out in the particular scene in order to figure out what to do and, not make a complete fool of themselves.
And I'm so glad that you've brought up this point a couple of times about how it's really okay and actively encouraging us to, we need to know what it is our main character is thinking. And that doesn't mean going immediately to, we're going to use body language to convey that. Because I will say firsthand that I fell into this camp of, we just want to show, not tell, right? Well, how do we do that? Well, we're going to continue to rely on our sense of vision, and we're going to fill the page with these body language cues. And the next thing you know, if you were me back in, 2012 or 2013, you have taken a already monstrously long manuscript and you filled it full of stage directions, right? And that's not exactly what it is we're aiming to do in the realm of authorial fiction. If we were writing a play, perhaps, yes, we'd want to give those clues into the character. But when we actually embrace our character, when we let them take the wheel, so to speak, and we think about what it is they're going to be thinking about and let them guide us through the page, we get that strong sense of internality, which is, again, the why of our story. And that is where this notion of compelling storytelling comes from. At least that's kind of how I went along my journey to discovering that for myself anyway.
Yeah, exactly. I think so many of the things that people are taught in that I'm doing. You can't see me, thankfully. I'm doing air quotes right now. The writing world. I mean, if the writing world were a person, I would punch it in the nose, like meaningfully, to tell you the truth, because the notion of show don't tell is so deeply misunderstood. People think it means exactly what you just said: show us visually, as opposed to telling us, and that could not be less true. What show don't tell means, it means show me why it matters to somebody. It doesn't mean show it to me visually. It means take me inside and show me how what's happening is affecting someone, meaning the meaning that they're reading into it, which is where all emotion comes from. People make the same mistake with emotion. They want to get emotion onto the page, so they either use body language or say they were happy, they were sad, they were crying. Totally, again, not how you get it onto the page. It is the way that the character is struggling internally with what to do. And what that allows the reader to do is to step into their mindset, which is what we do. I mean, it's literally a Vulcan mind meld, so that when they're struggling with that same inner quandary, literally, and it's, again, on the page as the character's struggling with it, they're experiencing it. And it is the experience of it that triggers the emotion, not naming an emotion. That doesn't do anything. That locks us out. In fact, I'll tell you something interesting. I was reading about a study where they decided to see in writers, what area of the writer's brain was being stimulated when they wrote. So they got a group of people who were non-writers and a group of people who were successful writers. And they wired them up, and they found that for the people who weren't writers, who were not professional writers, the area of their brain light up was the visual senses. In other words, they were picturing something like you're watching a movie with no sound, and they were just transcribing literally externally what's happening. The writers, the successful writers, I think it was the Wernicke part of the brain, the part that accesses language, the part that was going much, much deeper. It's not, that's why people make that mistake. As I was saying, I can't tell you how many manuscripts I've read where the quote unquote writing was okay, and the plot seemed to be rip-roaring, but you could have cared less because you were just, watching something that you had no emotional tie to, because you don't have an emotional tie to a what. You have an emotional tie to a who, and then the why they're struggling with it. And if we don't have that, it doesn't matter how externally dramatic it seems, it's crickets.
And one of the things that I'd like to shift to here now is exploring some of the, we'll call them brass tacks for lack of a better phrase. My brain couldn't reach for anything deeper this time around, unfortunately. But
it's good because it's very visual and we get it. Simple as that.
It is. It's right there for us. And it's, like you say, accessibility. That's an important thing, right? We want people need to know where we stand. So let's turn now to this idea of wants and needs, because these are a big part of our lives as people. And so we would presume that our protagonists also need to have a diverse array of wants and needs. So how do wants and needs fit into the wired for story view of story?
Okay, well, here's the thing. Yes, absolutely. My fear is always, even the way that you just said that, if you don't mind my saying, an array of wants and needs. Not true. Every character, but particularly the protagonist, I'm going to hone it down, comes into the story wanting something specific. They step onto the page, there's something that they want, and they've wanted it for a very long time, and that's what sets their story-long agenda. Every character steps onto the page with a story-long agenda, and they are trying to bring that agenda to fruition, scene by scene by scene by scene. Now, that isn't to say that other wants don't spin off of that. Of course they do. But if you have a whole bunch of wants, then you got a whole bunch of different things going on. And what's your story? Story's about how somebody goes after what they want, but something is holding them back, and they've got to overcome that. And that thing holding them back isn't like, I want to climb Mount Everest, and the thing that's holding me back is that I'm a complete couch potato and I can't lift more than 2 pounds. That's not it at all. It's something internal. It's what I call a misbelief, which is a misbelief about human nature, something that comes into being in a character's in all of our lives. I can't tell you how many writers I've worked with who said, I was looking for my protagonist misbelief. and I found my own. All have them. But you're looking for that defining misbelief that has been kept your character from getting what they want from an early age. Probably it's part of what has created this problem that they're struggling with on page one. And then scene by scene by scene by scene, as they go after what they want, they're confronting this misbelief, which by then has been personified, in the choices that they've made and in the meaning that they read into things, so that it gives you a very solid blueprint is the wrong, I don't know what word to use, very solid guardrails that take you forward. Now, in terms of need, there's obviously, as we know in life, there's often a very big difference between what we want and what we need. And often a story is about how you get what you want only to discover it wasn't what you need. But even if what the character wants is genuinely what they want, you need to figure out why. And that goes to need. In other words, what is it going to mean to them to get it? They need it, and need is never, they need $1 million because they want to have a lot of money. It's not that. It's, what do they think it's going to say about them? What do they think it's going to say about them to the world? And then, of course, the question is, are they right? I mean, a great example, I think, are often, it's often romantic comedies, where the character thinks they want a certain person because it's going to give them a certain feeling. And I don't mean a generic feeling like love. I mean something it's going to say about themselves or say to the world, only to get that person and then realize, okay, wait a minute, I don't have that. It didn't fulfill the need I had. And then usually they figure out it was their sidekick that they've been in love with the whole time.
Yes, and I should say, too, to elaborate on this notion, or perhaps the language I chose earlier with this idea of an array of wants or needs, as I phrased it anyway, I suppose the manner through which I would think about that more generally would be, yes, in agreement with you that we have this primary, right, want or need. It is the thing that the character comes to the story needing or wanting in their life, but similar to how you and I go about having to make, or whether we're aware of all of them or not, which we're certainly not, 35,000 decisions a day. Throughout our story, there are a number of small decision points that our character is going to have to, well, make a decision at. And in those moments, we will get better insight into perhaps, say, a more nuanced understanding of the particular want or need that they believe they have. And we can start to, at least in my view anyway, fill in that character a little bit more. So yes, the big main headline want or need, and I think that's kind of where we start to see the core of their inner conflict take shape, and also then often what leads us into theme. But I also just want to make sure that I don't want to confuse anyone with my vast array of wants and needs kind of thing.
Yeah, but the only thing I would say to that is those decisions are all part of bringing their agenda to fruition.
Yes.
Because writers will often do that. Well, this is an example of this, and that's an example of that. And that's how you end up with, and I have to say, I have read thousands of manuscripts. And, as I'm fond of saying, the vast majority of them, if you ask me what they're about, I'd say they're about 300 pages. I have no idea. They're just a bunch of things that happen. And that's why it really is about achieving this agenda that they step onto page one with, and they're trying to bring that to fruition as the story goes forward, so that you're always following that very specific cause and effect trajectory. And it means it makes it difficult to go off course. I always feel when writers go, I don't know what happens next, it means, well, you haven't done your homework. You don't have a story yet. You're just going to end up with a bunch of things that happen.
Right. So, and I like the idea of thinking that of this as a sort of like that guardrail parameter, because if you know what that character's deep, dark want or need happens to be when they come to the story, well, that's your guiding light. What is it that needs to happen next? Well, what's the next thing that they would want to do or pursue or try to get or obtain to fulfill this deep, dark need or want that they have, kind of thing.
Yes, exactly. And if I could just say, it's not just knowing it. You have to, in my opinion, you have to do, not you personally, obviously, a ton of work and writing in as much depth as you would imagine that you're going to have to do on page one in order to really dig into this. Otherwise, you have no story. It's not a general thing. Well, they want something general, and you kind of know in general, you've summed up why they wanted, what might have happened in their past, and now you're writing forward. You have to dive into that and write it with as much work, go as deep as you would literally in what you're envisioning page one going forward of the novel will be. A lot of it comes into the novel in the form of flashbacks, in the form of the thoughts that go through the character's mind. But it's not enough to do it in general. And writers will do that all the time. They'll go, well, this is a summation, or they'll have a 2 or 3 page thing about summarizing. Summarizing is a really bad idea. And I'll tell you why. Summarizing, their character's past. And here's the problem. In real life, if you're going to summarize something, it's already happened in great depth. The specificity is already there, and you're just pulling out a summary so you could, say it, quickly to somebody else. When writers do it, there's nothing more than a big generality. There's no specific. There's no anything, and a generality can't play forward. The stories and the specifics, there is a lot of work to do before you get to page 1, or else it's like saying, I'm going to write a 327-page novel about the most important turning point in someone's life who I know nothing about. Which goes to, if I could just circle back to one thing we said before, which is about knowing what the character wants, and deeply why. Not just why so you answer it in a sentence or a page, but why, going really deeply back to where that need came from, and then watching it grow specifically in scenes that you would figure out what to write based on what you're thinking the novel is going to be about, so that it has grown, it's escalated, it's complicated by the time you get to page 1. And writers will sometimes go, I'm sure you've probably heard this, they'll go, but my character doesn't know what he wants. And you want to go, I go, okay, that's totally fine. But you have to know.
Right.
You have to know all the way down, because otherwise, first of all, how can you create a story where he figures it out or she figures it out? And second of all, because that character is giving off tells all the way. The same way, like when people play poker, right? And good poker players can read other poker players' tells. Now, the poker players who are giving off tells, the last thing they want to do is telegraph what's in their hand, and yet they do. Same thing with characters.
Kill Your Darlings Candle Company is thrilled to announce the names of their first 3 original scented candles. Yes, Kill Your Darlings Candle Company is a candle company that believes in you, the writing community, and they demonstrate that belief by crafting their candles sustainably, by keeping creativity in mind, and by giving back to organizations that support writers and readers in the form of direct financial contributions. But yes, those first 3 candles I mentioned, well, they're the aptly named Kill Your Darlings Original, Happily Ever After, and Dramatic Irony. Yeah. Want to know what these candles smell like and how you can bring their light into your life? Head to kydcandleco.com to learn more and place your first order between July 15th and July 31st to take 20% off your order and double Kill Your Darlings donation to the writing or reading-related organization of your choosing. Again, that's kydcandleco.com to start shining on and burning bright today. And I will say this to the writers out there who would answer that question of, well, my character doesn't know what they want. Well, the manuscript that I am working on right now, on page 1 of that manuscript, the character gets an email. Shouldn't be a big deal, right? Just an email from his dad. Well, here's the problem. His dad has allegedly been dead for 20 years. And now the character must confront whether they want to see their dad again or not, assuming he is, in fact, alive. And you know what? The character doesn't necessarily know which direction he's going to go, but me, as the writer, I knew, because I knew the character better at that moment than the character knew himself. And in fact, over the course of the manuscript, he finally arrives at that understanding of self that I had for him all along. I don't know if that fits that model exactly that you were just describing there, but that's a recent experience I have had anyway in trying to evaluate that for myself and for this particular character.
Yeah, if I could just say one thing, I mean, obviously you know a lot more than what you could just say in 30 seconds, but the other thing that you did there that is really good is I was once speaking in Cedar Rapids, Iowa at SCBWI conference, and there was an editor there, brilliant, and I think it was her, I think it was Jill Santapolo who said that in college, her mentor said to her, the first paragraph is a promise you make to your reader.
Yes.
And what you just said was that. You told me where we were going. It's like, okay, now I want to know. Now I'm totally curious. And a lot of writers, as I'm sure you've seen, go, don't say that. You're giving it all away.
Nope.
We're going to save it for a reveal. And the irony is that writers hold back the very things that would lure us in. It's just a perfect example of what an irony is.
Oh, and I love the idea too of thinking about it in terms of promises made to readers, because it is something that I try to reinforce all of the time. Yes, in my own writing, but especially when working with clients, because there is that propensity for, well, I need to make sure that I reveal, quote unquote, this at a certain time. And it's like, no, you don't reveal anything until you've made a promise to your reader that the reader then trusts you to fulfill through the course of your story. You are just fulfilling promise after promise after promise, building up to that very first promise that you made to that reader. And when you do that, when you build a strong bond of trust between you and your readers and your characters and your readers, they're in. You've got them invested, but you have to be willing to make a promise and you have to be willing to fulfill it by the time the story is over.
Oh yeah, and to keep it all the way through, so it doesn't go slack or go neutral or or go missing. But yeah, I think that is absolutely true. And the other big thing that writers will do is by wanting to hold things back for a reveal. I mean, I always tell people don't even think that. Don't go there, because then, like you said, they're so afraid they're going to give it away that they'll have characters not think about the very thing that they would absolutely think about because it would give it away. And so they've just not only completely invalidated their characters, but because we have no idea what's going on. And it's true. I haven't heard a writer say in a long time, but I remember, back when I was teaching more boots on the ground, to classes, you'd hear it all the time. But the answer is going to be on page 20. And it's like, well, I don't know that. I'm right here on page 10. How do I know this is going to be any? I mean, often, even if they put the answer in the next paragraph, we've already stopped and thought, I don't know what's going on here. Yeah, no, you gotta, I personally think that writers should never write with quote unquote the reader in mind. I'm going to fool the reader as if, and they do it a lot. Like, the reader, like I own the reader. The minute I start, they start my book, I own them. And now I can tease them and I can do all this. And I always think, don't ever do that. Go into the mind of your protagonist and give us the story. If you do it right, we will be there. But if you're doing anything to manipulate a reader, you're lost. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's because it's not a manipulation game. Like you say, it's all about that protagonist. And if our protagonist can be some sort of, and I know we're maybe going to get a little more meta than we want to get because it takes us away from focusing on the protagonist. But if we are willing to at least accept that the protagonist is but one vehicle for forming a bond of trust with a reader, as opposed to assuming that we have our reader's attention and assuming they will stick with us the whole time, well, then we have a more nuanced understanding. We are actually embracing our character as a person. We're embracing our readers as people and ourselves as artists, rather than someone who is just deserving of a reader's time or deserving even of our character's time, frankly, if we're just going to walk them into walls and, never connect any actual dots.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, really think of it that way. It is a Vulcan mind meld. I mean, your reader, they've done functional MRI studies that show when you're lost in a story, the same areas of your brain light up that would light up if you were doing what that main character's do. I mean, we literally are, it's biological. We are there because the purpose of story is to take us into someone else's head so that we can experience things that we haven't yet experienced to see what it would really be like. Because it's not like what it is on the surface. I love to say to writers, because on the surface, what do we always hear about the surface? We hear people say, and I bet you everybody in your audience has heard this expression, never let him see his sweat. That's the surface. And what does it imply? That beneath the surface, we're sweating buckets. That's what story is about. It's about those buckets. I once had a student at UCLA. She said, I know on the surface I look really put together. And she really did. She said, I know on the surface I look put together, but inside I'm a raging mess. And I'm trying to keep all of you from seeing it. That's what story's about, the raging mess. Because the truth is, all of us want to pretend that we don't have any problems and that we're perfect. And all of us are raging messes on the inside. So if you don't let us access your protagonist's raging mess, we got nothing. You're not giving us anything. You're not teaching us anything. That's what we come to story for, what goes on beneath the surface. But again, that isn't something that we are supposed to intuit. That's not something that comes through metaphor or through subtext. That's something that comes through through this internal struggle. And I'll tell you, I mean, I was once working with a writer who said, okay, yeah, you're telling me it's all this internality and backstory. She said, I want to see what you're talking about. So she said, she started to read Sharp Objects, which is Gillian Flynn, who wrote Gone Girl, her first book. Mm-hmm. And she said, I took a highlighter and I decided to highlight everything in the book that was this internality and backstory. She said, I'm halfway through the book and I've highlighted 60. That's 60% of the book.
Wow.
It's everywhere. Backstory and this internality is laced into everything. Often, even when you're reading in the third person and when things are being described, they're not being described, quote unquote, objectively. They're being described, and the meaning ascribed to them, even in the way the description rolls out, is through the eyes of the point of view character, always, what it means to them. That's what we come to story for. Without it, you just got a bunch of things that happen, sadly.
And I know that we focused a lot here on wants and needs. I got really excited. You got really excited. And I want to make sure that we still give ourselves an opportunity to talk about something that we're just starting to dip our toes into here, actually, which is this idea of perhaps flashback, foreshadowing, subplots. All of this stuff can get really fraught in that sort of maybe 101 view of writing, where you'll often hear new writers, they maybe go so hard on backstory that the common adage becomes, well, just cut your flashbacks, right? That's something that you get all of the time. But that is not, as you write in Wired for Story, that's not the approach that we want to take, right? So why is that the case? And how is it that flashbacks, foreshadowing, subplots, all of that, how does that bring this meaning to our stories?
Okay, and I would like to say one thing is that since I wrote Wired for Story close to 10 years ago now, and I then wrote a Story Genius, and I made there's certain things I would never talk about again. Just a couple of things that I see very differently now. One is subplot, and one is theme. I would never use the word theme again, ever. Subplot. I think of subplot, and I kind of would revise a little bit of what I said in Wired for Story. Subplot I really see as storylines. Each character has a storyline, and those storylines are almost always a subplot. I wouldn't use the word subplot kind of for one of the same reasons I don't use the word theme, because it's general. It doesn't mean anything. A ton of different people would have a different notion of what a subplot is. You can't hold on to it. It's not specific enough. So I tend to think of it as a storyline, and the storylines, when you think of most subplots that you'd see in a movie or in a novel, are personified by a particular character. So I like to go into that. But in terms of flashback, let's talk about that, and backstory. Backstory, it never comes in, as I said, because the reader needs to know something. The reason backstory comes in is the same reason it comes into our lives, our brains, when we make sense of something. So let me give you a little bit of brain science first, if you don't mind.
Please.
I just finished reading a book called, literally, Your Brain is a Time Machine by a neuroscientist. And here's what our brains do. The sole purpose of our brain is to record past memories in order to predict the future. Our brain is a time machine. So when something happens in your life that feels important, and again, I won't go into all of the science behind your amygdala and what it stimulates and what makes our brain give something kind of a backstage pass to long-term memory as opposed to short-term memory, which is why you meet someone and 2 minutes later you can't remember their name because it doesn't really matter. But the reason we remember things is because our brain has determined that this is something we might need to know in order to help us survive. And the reason for that is because when we get into a situation, one of those situations that our cognitive unconscious can't just handle, right? So of those, 3,500 decisions we make a day, 70 we're aware of them. Of a very few of them, we have to stop and think about it because our cognitive unconscious doesn't know what to do. When we've got to stop and think about something, really focus on it, what our brain does is it pulls up past memories in order to figure out how to deal with what's happening in a way that's going to help us achieve our agenda for the future. That's when backstory comes in. Backstory comes in and it's laced into every page because in every scene, your point of view character is going to be forced to make a decision, to have a little aha moment, and to make some kind of change in how they see things. And in order to do that, they pull up the past to decide what this means, where risk is, how it's going to help them get what they want, and then they do what they do. That is how backstory comes in, foreshadowing comes in, again, in the way that they look at the future, in the conclusions that they draw, in the way that they are assuming that if they do X, Y is going to happen, because it allows us to know what they want Y to be. And often, and when Y, I mean the letter Y, I don't mean WHY, what it's going to be. And often, it's another reason why not to hold things back. Often the reader is 3 steps ahead of the protagonist, and we're protective of that person. So when they go, okay, I don't need to take my lunch today. I know that even though I'm going to be starving, and in order to get a good grade in the test, I have to eat lunch. But Bridget's going to be there at school to give me that. We already know Bridget has been kidnapped by aliens. We're going, oh my God, no, they're not going to get it. They're going to fail the algebra test. I mean, that's a lot of the way foreshadowing comes in. But all of it comes in service of what's happening in the moment. Backstory comes in service of what's happening in the moment, always.
And one of the things that I wrote down on my notepad here is you were relaying all of that is this idea that we can use the past to inform the present in order to determine our character's future. And so we can see this sort of inextricable tie between our character needing to know where they have been, because without that knowledge of where they have been, well, how is it that they're supposed to make a decision in the moment? It's all just new, and it feels like they are, and this is, I think, another thing that I see in manuscripts all of the time, is a protagonist that is simply serving as a proxy for the reader's experience of a story, right? The character isn't actually driving that story. They're just a pass-through because they have nothing to rely on, right?
Oh, yeah. That is the most successful writer I've worked with. Came to me, and that was her problem. She had just gotten an MFA from Columbia. She was a brilliant writer. Her main character, who was 14, but it wasn't a YA, was really astute. Like, she could look at her best friend and kind of know why she's doing what she's doing. She could look at her mom, and her parents had gotten a divorce, and kind of figure out what's going on with her mom. But she had no agenda. This goes back to agenda. She had nothing that she wanted, so she was merely reactive. So something would happen, she'd react to it, and then we had no reason to read forward because there was no momentum. There was no urgency. There was nothing that she wanted, no external. This is where a plot does come in. Again, plot, protagonist first, plot, story first, plot second, because they bring the plot on themselves. But there was no overarching anything that was going on. It was just this and then that and then that. And it's just nothing but frankly boring. Even the things that she was thinking about in terms of her mom or her, her friend, it never affected her. She was just objectively kind of very astutely, as if she was a therapist, diving into what was going on with them and knowing by the time she came down and gave the character an agenda and gave her that want, it changed everything. Yeah. And I think she ended up getting over a $2 million advance. She got a big advance.
We'll take a quick break here from this episode of the R.R. Campbell Writescast to talk about Scrivener. Yes, anytime we do a deep dive into the craft of writing, I like to bring up Scrivener because for me, anyway, Scrivener has always been there to make sure that I am in a position to focus only on my craft. I don't need to worry about, when is my actual document going to load? How long is this going to take now? Where did I store my most recent draft? Scrivener takes care of all of that for you. It helps you even store things like character information, character backstory, whatever it is that you have typed, you can store it in one convenient place within folders within the program itself. It makes jumping between chapters seamless. There's no need for all of that scrolling. And like I said, it's going to help you keep things organized so that you can focus on the craft of writing. And right now, listeners to the Writescast Network can get a 30-day free trial of Scrivener if they head to bit.ly/writing software. Yes, get a 30-day free trial of Scrivener, and if after 30 days you love it, which I'm sure you will, you can keep Scrivener and it'll help the Writescast Network out, it'll help you out, everybody wins. So again, that's bit.ly/writing software to try Scrivener and get yourself focused on what really counts, the craft of writing, today. And that's the importance of this reactivity but also not just reactivity, it's about proactivity, which ties us also into, and it ties us really well into this idea of cause and effect. Because one thing that I like to talk about a lot, whether it's on this show or with my clients, is that it isn't just about that reaction, it's about these action, reaction, chains. And so I know that you have written about cause and effect in Wired for Story. And I'm curious, just for the sake of listeners here, what cognitive secret does the notion of cause and effect give us that insight into? And why is all of this so important when we're focusing on story?
Well, I mean, because cause and effect is how we make sense of everything. Causality, if this, then that. We're looking for that, if, then, therefore. We're looking for that from the moment that we're born, and we understand innately, going to a cognitive secret, we understand that innately. If this, then that. So when you give us anything in a story, we're going to go, okay, if this, then that's going to happen. And if it doesn't, we bail. We're done, because we're inherently looking for that internal logic. Again, the character's internal logic. Without that, what do you have? You just have a bunch of things that happen. That's why, if you don't mind my saying so, I firmly believe that the two, people often hear, right, especially new writers, that there are two schools of writing. There are plotters and there are pantsers. And pantsers meaning people who write by the seat of their pants. And I personally say a pox on both your houses. Neither one works. I do not understand why people pants at all. I think it's why they say that out of 100 people who sit down to write a novel, only three make it to the end of a first draft. And of those three, when you talk about, okay, they're going to finish the first draft, maybe they'll go back and do more drafts, which they should. Maybe they'll polish it. Then they'll finally query and agents. So let's say maybe another person has dropped out. So that's two people left. And I can tell you, having worked as an agent, I mean, the number out there is that 96% of manuscripts are rejected by agents. Frankly, I think that's low. I would put it at more like 98% of manuscripts. So that means out of those 2%, 98% of them, which means maybe one arm, is successful. The rest of the other two are not, because of exactly what we're talking about. Because either they've pantsed forward and they've got just a whole bunch of things that are happening, and then they try to just write it really well, or they've plotted. And when people just make a plot that goes to what you were just saying, which is then they plunk a character into it and they have them do what a generic person would do. And there are no generic people. The one thing we never do leave home with is our past, which is what we use to read meaning into things. Nothing has meaning in and of itself. We tend to think that that's true, that there's some objective meaning out there, and we all kind of, know what that is, other than people who are really, really screwed up. And we hope they get a lot of therapy and join us out here in real reality soon. But the truth is, we all make sense of the world based on one thing and one thing only. And that is simply what our specific past experience has taught us. And that's where meaning comes from. And emotion telegraphs meaning, but that's where meaning comes from. And so if you don't have that, and I mean granularly for your protagonist and several other characters, all you've got is a bunch of things that would happen, or just a very generic thing. So plotting doesn't work because you're, again, starting on page 1 and creating a scenario. And once you actually have characters who, if they have any kind of self there, very well might not do the things that you want them to do. Or if they did the thing on page 1, they'd never do the thing on page 20. And then every character becomes what I like to call a plot enabler, right? And their goal is just to enable what's going to happen. And then, have you ever noticed that when people fall into that, it starts to get to be like a race, like how fast can they hit the plot point to get to the next quote unquote plot point? And it just doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way.
I am really fascinated, too, by the way that you have described this sort of a pox upon the houses of both the plotters and the pantsers, because listeners to the show, those who have been around here for years, know that for quite a while, Lisa, I was an ardent plotter, right? I sat down, I knew what my manuscript was going to look like from point A to point Z, and I was able to write my way through it. And guess what? For a long time, I did that, and I wasn't getting any kind of meaningful result, right? Where were the publication contracts, right? I thought I had a story down. I thought I understood this stuff, but it wasn't until I examined all of that through the lens of knowing what it is that the character wanted and knowing how their past might inform their present and truly ensuring that that was actually guiding their decisions and that their decisions weren't being informed by what I, as the writer, wanted. Well, then sure. As long as I knew that, I could put together an outline in any degree that I would want to or not, but I have to know all of that other stuff first. And conversely, I decided for fun that it would be interesting to, after years of developing this sort of outlining, regimen that I had for myself, I decided, I'm going to pants a novel. And I thought that I had just pantsed this novel to start the year. And then I look back on it now, Lisa, well, I didn't pants that novel. You know why I didn't pants that novel? Because I knew from page one what the character wanted, again, whether he recognized it or not. And so I wasn't truly pantsing it. I knew the direction I was headed, and it was all about what that need is, what that thing is he needs to do, and how his past was going to inform the place he ultimately arrived at, basically.
Right.
So
and I would assume what his aha moment is at the end. Meaning, because it isn't about that a character achieves something. It's about what they overcame to do it, meaning the realization that they had that allowed them to, to make that change. And not just the realization itself, but the shift in logic, the shift in what caused that change, and the way they're now reading a different meaning into, I often, the way I would say it is, they've realized their misbelief for what it is wrong. But it's what leads to that realization and the shift in logic as they have it. That's what we come for. That's what we're wired for, is that.
It's that slow realization, at least in this particular story, that over the course of the manuscript, the character comes to realize, what I've been doing to get by all of these years is relying on little white lies and being rather cynical. And it's all actually just a shield to hide from the fact that I'm not ready to embrace this better version of myself because, well, that would be hard. And I don't want to do that thing. And so as the manuscript goes on, well, we see these moments where he has that knee-jerk thought and then thinks to himself, again, we're letting readers into the character's head. No, I need to stop that. What is wrong with me? I literally just told myself I was going to make a promise to be better about this. By the time we get to the end, it's the big realization that it wasn't about just turning a switch. It was about having to go through this process to become the best person that he could be. Right.
Yes,
and that's what's at the heart of any character change story, which is, story.
Every story is about character. And you're absolutely right. They earn their way to that big aha moment, scene by scene by scene by scene. And it doesn't mean it's so, as I'm sure with your character there, it's not a one-way street, meaning they're just going forward. It's one step forward, two steps back. Otherwise they would get there immediately. So that's what we come for, again, is that internal change. That's what story is about. It's not about an external change. It's about an internal change. It's not about the plot. It's about how the plot changes the protagonist.
And I love all of that you have said right there, Lisa. I want to make sure that before we draw this conversation to a close, that we give listeners an opportunity to know where it is that they can find you online and what it is that they can expect next from you. So why don't you go ahead and share a little of that with listeners now?
Sure. You can find me online at my website, wiredforstory.com. I work one-on-one with writers. All the information is there. And I guess the thing I'm the most excited about is I have, this will be for in the future, I have just finished writing a third book called, we're going back and forth on the subtitle with my publisher and I, but the title is Story or Die. And I'm going to tell you, the old subtitle is How to Use Brain Science to Create Your Own Story to Convince, Persuade, and Inspire. But there's a better subtitle than that, only longer. And it's actually for story and the world. So that, in other words, if you're literally trying to sell something, or if you're an influencer or a nonprofit or trying to convince your kid not to text and drive, it's not only about how to create a story to do that, but the part of it that I like the best is that it goes into the brain science behind how and why we make the decisions that we do. And it does two things that I think are really important, especially at this time in the world, which is, one, it really tries to show how biologically important it is to be able to step out of our own shoes and step into the belief system of someone else without rolling your eyes, without vilifying it, understanding that even when people believe something diametrically opposed to what you believe, even if they're wrong, and they probably are, but that they believe it for heartfelt reasons, and to really go down into that. And then the other thing is, and this is something I know I talk about in both my other books, Wired for Story and Story Genius, is that really we make every decision we make based on emotion, and that emotion is something that we, in our culture, maybe in all cultures, have vilified, when actually emotion is what keeps us alive. Emotion is not the monkey wrench in the system. Emotion is the system. We make every decision we make ever based on emotion. If you couldn't feel emotion, you couldn't make a single rational decision ever. So emotion is really it. I can't stand when people go, oh, they're too emotional, or put your emotion aside. And it's like everything. I always want to go, dude, calm is an emotion. Right?
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
It's feeling. It's feeling telegraphs meaning. That's what emotions do. They let us know what something means to us, and then we take whatever action we're going to take, no matter how rationally we've thought it out. So anyway, and I guess the only other thing I'll say is that I do have a couple of courses, one at a website called Creative Live, and then one at, I think it's still called lynda.com on Story, if anybody's interested in that. So that is me.
Plenty of opportunities there to stay connected with Lisa Cron out there in the digital universe. So thank you so much, Lisa, for sharing that with us. I'm really grateful for this conversation, and I'd love to have you back another time.
Oh, my pleasure. There's nothing I love more than talking story. Just don't tell my husband I said that.
That'll do it for my interview of Lisa Cron, the author of Wired for Story. Thanks to Lisa for joining me, and thanks to you, dear listeners, for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you could leave the Writescast Network a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. This will help the Writescast Network reach more writers like you, and building that sense of community is what we, and I hope you, are all about. To those of you who have already left us a rating and review, thank you. I'd also like to thank the Writescast Network's patrons who contribute to our programming financially at patreon.com/Writescast. In exchange for their support, Writescast Network patrons get access to some great patron perks, including Writescast swag like stickers, t-shirts, and mugs, discounts on my editing services, and entries in monthly drawings for partial manuscript critiques performed by yours truly. If this sounds like something you'd be interested in, you can join patrons like Laura Hazen and Angeline Boley today in supporting our programming directly at $1, $2, or $3 per episode or per month. Any level of contribution gets you access to some of those fantastic patron perks, so become a supporter today by making your pledge at patreon.com/Writescast. That's patreon.com/Writescast. Thanks as well to our on-air sponsors Dandelion Web Marketing, Lost Lake Press, and Kill Your Darlings Candle Company. To learn more about them or our other sponsors, you can visit writescast.net/sponsors. Coming up next on the Writescast Network is an episode of Novel Approaches featuring return co-host Maggie Derrick. I had a blast the last time the two of us could chat about tropes and cliches, and I'm really looking forward to sharing our latest deep dive into another writerly topic with all of you when our newest episode debuts July 10th. In the meantime, say hello on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Writescast or by searching for the Writescast Network. We're also available by email at writescast@gmail.com, and you can now call us at area code 608-284-8342, where you can leave a voicemail with questions for future guests or other matters you'd like us to address in our programming. Again, that number is 608-284-8342. To reach me personally, you can visit rrcampbellwrites.com or holler at me on Twitter as @IamRRCampbell. I love hearing from listeners of all backgrounds, so please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, this is R.R. Campbell signing off. Write on and write well. This is the Writescast Network, brought to you by Dandelion Web Marketing, Lost Lake Press, and Kill Your Darlings Candle Company, and always streaming at writescast.net.